Hello everybody, Jose Rodriguez here. Today I want to talk about editing programs and why I use certain ones more than others. I own Photoshop CC 2017. I own Lightroom, also the latest one, and I also own QIMAGE. Now, Photoshop initially, decades, I guess, ago, started off being more of a graphic type program and not much related to imaging as we seem to use it now. And it has grown into this massive do-it-all type utility. And although I do use it for certain aspects, I have gravitated over to Lightroom, and I'll tell you why. And then QImage as well. In Photoshop, say you shoot RAW and you open up an image, it will automatically open up into your RAW converter. That's part of your Photoshop install. And that RAW converter will allow you to perform some functions. I'll just leave it at that. You can do color, you can do contrast, you can do all sorts of things. You can do levels adjustment, so many things that you can do. You can do lens correction, all sorts of things. And then you finally open it in Photoshop. And underneath, at the very lowest portion of the little window that you get with the RAW converter, you will see the word open. When you click on that, you're able to access various formats that you can actually export out of that little module directly to Photoshop. You will not be working any longer with the raw image. You'll have to convert it to some other format that is directly supported by Photoshop. And that could be TIFF, that could be PSD file, that could be a JPEG, that could be any other format that Photoshop will accept. JPEG, of course, is highly compressed. You lose about 90% of your information that that raw image contains. So I recommend, obviously, you do not use it. So you can then export to PSD and then work off of that PSD or a TIFF if you like. And you could also pick the working space or the color space that you want to work in, and also the bit rate. Well, that's fine. Then you have a second image that you will then work on Photoshop, and then you'll have to save it. And if it's a non-lossy type format like PSD and TIFF, you'll be okay. But the fact that you already converted it, already made some changes to the original information that the raw image contained, whether it's on the negative aspect or not. I just do not like converting to anything. And let's jump over to Lightroom. Lightroom allows me to work from the original raw file from my Nikon camera, Canon camera, whatever. And I can open it. I can do whatever edits I wish to do on it. And I can close the program. Everything I did to that raw file is remembered. And it's remembered in some sort of weird little text type file, like a I don't even know what to call it, metadata maybe. But all it does is it applies a list of changes to that raw image, which it opens, and then it opens it into basically very similar to a ProPhoto RGB color space, which is the largest color space I believe you can normally work on. There might be others. I'm not an expert, but all I know is that that raw image, when it's opened in Lightroom, is basically decrypted and shown to you in a visible manner, and nothing has happened to the file. Okay, there has been no reduction in quality. There has been no reduction in quality due to some conversion you did to another file format. So when you view it and you edit and you brighten and you sharpen and you change color and you dodge and you burn and you crop, everything that you do is just remembered as metadata. So it's a whole list. In fact, you can go back in the history and go back to any particular step that you performed on that file. So when you close it and you open it back up, it opens that file at the last point in your editing sequence. that you were at. So when you print it, when you go to the print module, nothing is being converted. It is just basically creating a virtual representation of that raw image in visual form containing those edits. And when you print it, you're printing it at the largest color space imaginable that Lightroom works in. Not so in Photoshop. If you accidentally open that raw image after you get done messing with it in the raw converter and you open it as a JPEG, you just threw away 90% of that information. Not good. It would be like a complete apple, and instead what you're using is the apple core. When you look at it, you can still tell it's an apple, but it's, 90% of it is gone. So not good. So that's why I love working with Lightroom. And Lightroom was originally designed by photographers for photographers, whereas Photoshop is more of a full featured graphic arts type, super bloated application. And I'll leave you with this last little excerpt from DigiDog. All processing from raw data is conducted with ProPhoto RGB color gamut, and so it is all processing from rendered images, even if they are not in ProPhoto RGB. This is talking about Lightroom. Images that are just passed through Lightroom print module, therefore, would use their color space for output. If you are moving from raw to print through Lightroom, it is all ProPhoto RGB color gamut. So stick with that. And then he goes on to explain why, and he gets very long-haired about that. But basically, that's what I do. And the same thing occurs in QIMAGE. QIMAGE is what we all call a non-destructive editing program. Lightroom is a non-destructive editing program. By non-destructive, I mean that nothing happens to the file, ever. QIMAGE is even more interesting. When you do any editing at all, and it could be 100 different steps, it creates a little tiny file that is paired up with the original raw file. And so what happens when you reopen it in QIMAGE, it opens up your raw file that's untouched, still untouched, and it just quickly applies that filter that you created. The filter contains all of the changes, all of the edits that you did to that file. It applies the changes or edits, and then you print it. Okay, if I take that little filter file and throw it away, when I reopen it, it'll look as it did originally before I even touched it. Okay, so that's non-destructive. In Photoshop, you would have to open a file, you would have to hit Control J or Command J and create a copy, and then do your edits on that copy and not touch your original. Otherwise, you are likely to permanently change your original image. In other words, if you do an edit to it and then you save it upon itself, then you have changed the original. You can never revert back to that. Once you close Photoshop, you cannot use Control Z anymore. Okay, so I like to work in a totally non-destructive way that is basically automatic for me. Photoshop, again, you have to physically make a copy of that file, and then that copy is the one you're going to edit. In Lightroom, you can make all sorts of virtual copies and apply a multitude of different edits, different looks to those virtual copies. You didn't really create copies, physical copies. These are all virtual, and your original file is safe. It has not been touched. It was only touched to open and visibly see it in its original raw form. And then as you apply changes, and if you make a virtual copy, basically you'll see two of them, but there's only really one. So it's virtually showing you a second copy with changes to that, and you can make a third, a fourth, a fifth, whatever. You can go back and print all of those as if they were real separate entities, but they're not. So that is wonderful. That's the best workflow I have come across, and Lightroom just keeps getting better and better and better, and it's relatively cheap to do the monthly rental of it, because that's how you use Lightroom and Photoshop nowadays. They usually have these sales for like $10 a month, And considering the fact that originally, Photoshop was like $700, and every year you would want to renew it. So no, totally worth it. So please consider that. If you are a Photoshop guy, then stick to it. Just work in a non-destructive way by always creating a copy. Control J immediately loads a copy right on top of your original. Hit the little eyeball to close that file, so you're only working on the top layer, the copy. And then when you save it, you can then save as, and then give it another name and save it as, instead of saving it upon itself, which is terribly destructive. We want to avoid that word. All right, thanks once again. I hope you enjoyed this video. We just hit 5,400 subscribers. Wow, that's amazing, and I thank you guys for that. I really do. And every day new people are finding out about this channel, and I really love it. And it's great because we're passing on as much information as we can, and that's the goal of this whole venture. All right, so thank you once again. Please subscribe, share, and like. And until the next time, happy printing, everybody. Bye-bye.